A day of national mourning this Monday as France buries former president and Paris mayor Jacques Chirac. World leaders, past and present, gathering in central Paris to pay their respects ahead of a private funeral service. Hello, you're watching France 24, where we're covering the memorial service and funeral of the late Jacques Chirac, following the former president's death last week at the age of 86. World leaders, including Russian President Vladimir Putin, Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri, and former US President Bill Clinton, attended a solemn memorial service at the Église Saint-Sulpice, led by the Archbishop of Paris earlier today. That ahead of a minute's silence that took place across public institutions and schools here in France. Now, France has been observing an official day of national mourning this Monday, as you just heard. The man also served as Prime Minister and Mayor of Paris during a political career that spanned more than 4 decades. Large crowds gathering outside the Église Saint-Sulpice today, with many keen to share their memories of a man they say was both compassionate and pragmatic. Luke Schrago reports.
It's a day of mourning across France as the country says goodbye to Jacques Chirac.
It's a page of history that's being turned.
I feel like I'm living through a historic moment in my life.
After people queued throughout the night to pay their respects to the former president, his funeral moved ahead in Paris on Monday, as crowds moved en masse towards the Saint-Sulpice church where the service was being held.
He was a great man who had absolute fantastic class in all circumstances, and he knew how to speak to everyone with simplicity and grandeur. That's what made contact with him so profound.
However, it may be one thing above all else for which certain people will remember the statesman.
He was against the war in Iraq, and I think that for France and for all of humanity, it was a good thing, because we realized afterwards through the media everything that had been invented by the Americans. He was the one who was right.
Elsewhere, Chirac's former counterparts were also arriving in the French capital for the ceremony and leaving their own tributes, with one of his successors speaking of the former president's willingness to break ranks.
He made choices that weren't those of his own party, on the death penalty, in vitro fertilization, and the fight against the far right. He didn't do it to provoke, he did it because he felt it within him.
After the public service, Chirac was buried next to his daughter Laurence in a private funeral at Paris's Montparnasse cemetery.
Now, we have been hearing a lot of emotional tributes here in France today, but Jacques Chirac was not without his fair share of scandal, especially in his later years. A little earlier, I spoke to Jim Shields, Professor of French Politics at the University of Warwick. I asked him, considering Chirac's checkered history later in life, how he would be remembered specifically outside of France.
I'm personally mystified by the extent and the intensity of the tributes that are being heaped upon Jacques Chirac over the past 3 days. Chirac's public standing as a politician and as a president was nothing like this. Jacques Chirac was a classic, many would say cynical operator within the Fifth Republic's presidentialist system, where he mastered the formula for success: launch a party as a vehicle for his personal ambition, eliminate your rivals, promise everything it takes to get elected, and seize the prize, even if it takes 2 or 3 attempts. Chirac expended much more energy plotting his route to the Elysée, over 20 years it should be said, than he expended trying to improve France once he got there. So it's a difficult question, weighing up this legacy. In office, he took the route of least resistance most of the time, preferring to preserve the status quo rather than disrupt it and challenge powerful vested interests that were opposed to change. After his first painful experience of street protests against his attempted reforms in 1995, He never tried serious reform at home again until an attempted labour market reform in 2006, which he again withdrew in the face of street protests. So there is that problem when weighing up Chirac's domestic legacy. On the other hand, he cut a large figure on the international stage, and the service that we've just witnessed today and those present are testament to that. He was a president who represented France well on the international stage. He spoke well for France. He was, in that sense, an old-fashioned Gaullist, putting France's interests first, and considering that it was the whole network of international relations was about furthering France's interests.
Now, Chirac was perhaps best known abroad for his staunch opposition to the Iraq War. There were no representatives, as far as I know, of the UK government at that memorial service earlier today at the Église Saint-Sulpice. Are we right to read anything into that, do you think?
I think the first thing you can read into it is that UK politics is in meltdown currently, as you probably know. The Tory party, the governing Tory party, is having its conference. The opposition is planning how it can unseat the government. So British politics at the moment, it has never been more inward looking. So that's the first thing I'd read into it. I don't think I'd read anything in terms of a snub to Jacques Chirac. The one person who might have been there, and I don't know why, I didn't see him there, and I suspect he wasn't, but the one person who might have been there was Tony Blair. But for whatever reason, he doesn't seem to have been present.
Following an intimate service at the military church at Invalides for Chirac's close family, President Emmanuel Macron presided over military honours for the late president. That ahead of a funeral procession that saw Chirac's coffin taken from Invalides to the Église Saint-Sulpice.
Full military honours for one of France's most beloved presidents. Inside the courtyard of the Hôtel des Invalides, the French President Emmanuel Macron and the Minister of Armed Forces lead the procession. The mood is solemn and grave as the French national anthem resonates in the Invalides Memorial Complex. The last post is sounded and the flag-draped coffin is placed in the center of the courtyard. French armed forces, police and gendarmes pay a last tribute to a president they served for 12 years. This is where France honors its heroes, and also where the emblematic Napoléon Bonaparte lays to rest. After a moment of silence, the coffin leaves in a funeral convoy. Surrounded by a large military escort, Jacques Chirac's coffin is then taken on a last ride through the streets of Paris, a city he so deeply loved. French people have lined up all the way to the Saint-Sulpice church to say farewell one last time to the man they call a political lion and a true Frenchman.
Now, France today is observing a day of national mourning for Jacques Chirac, and the only other country doing so is Lebanon. The country's Prime Minister, Saad Hariri, was in Paris this Monday, paying his respects to Chirac in person, testament to the close ties between Hariri and the Chirac family. A little earlier, I spoke to France 24's Leila Malala Allen in Beirut.
Incredible personal ties here. It really is one of the great political friendships of the 20th century, the friendship between Rafik Hariri, who is the Prime Minister of Lebanon, who was assassinated in 2005 and really is credited with bringing the country back together after the civil war, and Jacques Chirac. They became very close and they worked together to try and bring Lebanon back to its former glory as they saw it. Jacques Chirac really pushed to bring different sorts of funding here. He had several economic conferences. He also tried to hold other Middle Eastern events here, despite security concerns, to really help Lebanon come back to the fore. And in 2006 as well, in the war here with Israel, he very much pushed for Lebanese sovereignty, for Lebanese independence, and said that the world must get involved in stopping that bombing. He's remembered here as the man who stood up to the Americans when he felt the Americans weren't doing enough. Now, in 2005, his dear friend Rafik Hariri was murdered, and after that he made it his mission to set up this international commission to look into the inquiry into who killed him. And his son, Saad Hariri, who is now the Prime Minister, he said that he became a paternal figure to him after that. He released a statement on the day of Chirac's death saying that I have lost an older brother, a father, and Lebanon will not forget the hands that held and supported it. And he actually published an editorial this weekend in a Parisian weekly magazine in which he said the Lebanese and the Arabs have lost a political giant, a man who has dominated their consciousness for nearly a quarter of a century. So very, very personal and political ties on both counts. Now, there are also questions over just how close that relationship was. There are substantiated rumours that Chirac's eventual winning presidential campaign in 1995 was very largely funded by the Hariri family, and he later, after he left office, lived in an apartment in Paris that was owned by the Hariri family. So some questions there over whether perhaps those bonds were too close for two statesmen, but as I say, very fondly remembered here by the Hariri family.
Leila Malala Allen reporting there from Beirut. Now, on the international scene, Jacques Chirac will possibly be most remembered for his defiant opposition to the war in Iraq back in 2002. It's a stance that won him many admirers here in France, but also across the Arab world. Throughout Chirac's political life, Chirac was considered a friend of Arabs and also their leaders. However, for his critics, what was often termed his Arab policy lacked ideological coherence. Natasha Vesnich, Josh Vardy and Nicholas Rushworth have this report.
Jacques Chirac in 1996, visiting the old city of Jerusalem. His Israeli bodyguards at one point step in to block him from Palestinian well-wishers. The president, in an extraordinary television moment, loses his temper.
Want me to go back to my plane and go back to France? Is that what you want? Then let them go and let them do. No problem. No, this is not a method. This is a provocation. That is provocation. It's not a provocation. Please, you stop now.
Chirac, with all that, was hailed as a hero in the Arab world. His popularity grew with his resounding no to the US-led invasion of Iraq.
Whatever the circumstances, France will vote no, because we believe that there is no need to wage war to reach the objective we have set ourselves, that is, the disarmament of Iraq.
But Jacques Chirac also disappointed Arabs, as with his talks with the then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon in 2005. He stayed mum on the building of the Israeli-Palestinian wall and on pushing the peace process. Some critics say, when it came to the Arab world, his only policy was to maintain the status quo.
His knowledge of the Arab world focused more on its leaders than its people. Leaders who were autocrats or dictators. He focused more on them, on maintaining their power, instead of addressing the people's well-being.
His policy with respect to Syria and Lebanon centered on the fate of his friend, former Lebanese President Rafik Hariri. In 2000, he was the only Western leader to attend the funeral of the Syrian President Hafez al-Assad. 5 years later, Rafik Hariri was assassinated. With suspicions focused on Syria, Jacques Chirac openly split with its new leader, Assad's son, Bashar. Such changes in position ultimately made his so-called Arab policy difficult to discern.
Well, that's all we have time for right now. Thank you very much for watching our special coverage of the memorial services for former French President Jacques Chirac following his death at the age of 86. Chirac will be buried later this Monday in a private cemetery at the Montparnasse Cemetery. We'll leave you with some of the most important moments from an emotional day here in the French capital as the country bids farewell to one of its most respected leaders.
Lie. What does an Artlist subscription cover? Well, everything.